What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? One of the reasons why I love having conversations like the one that you're about to watch is because I generally have to dive back into information that I've already read, but I still don't exactly know right off the top of my head. And I generally like to just be able to know things or recall things right off the top of my head. That's not always going to be possible, but for this particular subject being mythicism or the history of Christianity, I feel like this is one of the topics that I probably should know right off the top of my head. In the discussion you're about to watch, Jordan and I are going to be discussing James, the supposed brother of Jesus, and his appearances in Paul's epistle to the Galatians, as well as in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, paragraph or whatever, 200. Jordan was a great interlocutor who didn't convince me of his position, but gave me a lot of great insight into my own position, which allows me to refine my arguments. Now, what's going to happen in this discussion is future Godless engineer here is going to jump in and kind of give you a fuller context of what we're talking about and maybe some things that I didn't necessarily bring up in the moment that are very important for you to understand. I hope y'all enjoy the discussion. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I am the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. But today, we're having a discussion with Jordan from Reason to Doubt. Hi there, Jordan. How you doing?
Doing pretty good.
Good. And you're not an apologist, by the way. You're definitely not an apologist. That's just my opening tagline that I use. But Jordan, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, like just where they can find you and who you are and everything like that?
Sure. I'm Jordan. You could fairly describe me also as a godless engineer. I'm an engineer and I'm an atheist. I run a channel called Reason to Doubt with my buddy Jared, who's a theologian or former theologian. We're both atheists. And we talk skepticism, basically. So we talk everything from, the historicity of Jesus to young earth creationism to aliens. We're just big on asking for evidence for claims. That's our thing.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I'll have whatever links you want to put in the description. I'll have that in the description so people can follow you where you post that and everything like that. So tonight, today, we're talking about mythicism, but very specifically on I guess maybe one or two verses, specific things in Paul where we seem to disagree on stuff. And I love having these kind of conversations because then because I truly do not understand, like, coming at it from the position that you do. I really don't understand that position, so I'm really trying to understand it, and maybe you can help me out with that.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So let's start off with the Galatians 1:19, the James, the brother of the Lord, or the Lord's brother, however you want to say it. So can you kind of tell people your position on it, like your thought process on that particular verse?
Yeah. So like you said, the verse is Galatians 1:18-19, and the context is that Paul is talking about how he spoke to people, and he's basically wants to make the point that he got his scripture not from other Christians, and he got it from his positions came from Jesus, right? And so the verse is that then after 3 years that I go to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, who's Peter, and stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. And the Greek there, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't actually speak or read Greek, is Delphoi or Delphon, I don't remember which one, but they both mean the same thing, to Kyrio, which means, brother of the Lord. And so Paul uses the language of fictive kinship all the time, referring to brother Titus or brother Barnabas or brothers and sisters all the time, all throughout his letters. However, he only uses this specific term, brother of the Lord, twice in Galatians and then again in Corinthians. So that seems to me to be indicative that this is not some generic term for all Christians, but specifically talking about an actual brother.
I mean, how do you know that it's not a generic term for all Christians?
So there's a couple arguments that I've read from various scholars. First things is the context of the two instances where it's used. So in Galatians, if it's basically used as an appellation, and for anyone who's not familiar, I'm sure you are, but if anyone in the audience isn't, in antiquity, people didn't have last names. So if you wanted to identify who you were talking about, you'd say some kind of thing about them. You'd appeal to some thing about them. So and so from town, whatever, or son of whomever. In this case, he's saying James, the Lord's brother, or the brother of the Lord. So
I don't see how that's comparable. Like, I don't see how the Lord's brother is a last name, or or anything comparable to like denoting a town or anything like that.
So I suppose he could just be adding on a title because he felt like it. I'm not Paul. I can't jump into his head, so I don't know. But it's common when you're referring to someone named James. James is a very common name in this time period, and so for someone to know what James he's talking about, it would be typical for him to say something about this James, so you can pinpoint what of the many Jameses there are that he's talking about, right? So in this case, he said he didn't see any other apostle except James. Which James? The Lord's brother. And if that's the case, then if it were simply a term for a generic Christian, it wouldn't do much for the reader to say that this was the Lord's brother, because that doesn't tell them who it was.
Well, it tells them that it's James, just another Christian.
Right,
And,
but
I mean,
if this he's distinguishing James as an apostle from Cephas,
he's not.
Well, he may be. It depends
No,
on.
he's not.
Okay, so for instance, if you look at Howard's paper, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Carrier's done a response on it. But the word "other" there refers to another thing in the same class. And the class he was referring to was apostles. So, like the way that Howard describes it in his paper, and just so people have the citation, it's "Was James an Apostle" by George Howard in Novum Testamentum. What a pretentious name for a journal. But in any case, he says that the way you'd use "other" there is kind of like if you had elements and you said that let me pull up the exact thing. Basically, while Esther is described as being an element other than the four, it's still an element. So that's the sense in which he means other, according to Howard. And if that's the case, then when he says, when he being Paul, when Paul says they didn't see an apostle other than James, James would still be in the class of apostles. Now, Carrier disagrees. Carrier basically appeals to Trudinger, which is who, I know this is confusing for anyone who hasn't actually read these papers. Trudinger wrote a paper. Howard responded to him. Carrier appealed to Trudinger to respond to Howard. And so Carrier basically said that they are part of the same class. They're both Christians. But that, unfortunately, doesn't hold up if you read Trudinger, because Trudinger's source, Lightfoot, the argument on which Trudinger is basing his assertion is that requires that they be apostles. And that's in page 1 of his paper, Trudinger's paper, which is, the title's in Greek. I'm not even going to attempt to say it. But if you find Howard's paper, you'll find Trudinger's.
What up? Future GE here, and I just wanted to pop in and give you guys some better context to the discussion that we're having right now in the conversation. In this section, Jared kind of presents Carrier as if he's only making this particular point, or that him as a non-expert is sort of making this point, which at this point in the conversation, we're talking about Paul and the Greek formulation of the brother of the Lord here in Galatians 1:19. Carrier is definitely an expert in Koine Greek. He knows how to read it and write it and speak it and all this other stuff. So he's definitely an expert himself. But more importantly, Carrier is not only using Trudinger, but also Hans Dieter Betz and both Trudinger and Betz both list off a number of scholars in their respective works that agree with their position on whether or not this James grammatically was considered an apostle. In fact, the language used here in Galatians 1:19 in the original Greek actually indicates that both Cephas and James are part of at least one class, and that would be Christians. Cephas is notably identified as an apostle, but is clearly separated from the general Christian known as James. On the screen right now is the full explanation from Carrier on his position concerning the grammar of Galatians 1:19. And this is in his On the Historicity of Jesus. He explains that the arguments that Howard presents only confirms that both Cephas and James are in fact Christians, and that Paul would have had to have written a more convoluted sentence in order to get Howard's point across. And these are the expert opinions on this passage, not just Carrier's. I feel like representing Carrier as being this lone outlier or this small fraction of, a group of scholars is a bit misleading, because it seems to portray this idea that Carrier is not amongst other scholars, or that Carrier isn't using other experts in the field. Carrier is putting pieces together as well as making his own points using his own expertise. Now, let me ask you this. Do you consider, who do you think Paul thought the Lord was? Do you think the Lord was a celestial figure, or do you think the Lord was a historical figure?
Well, for Paul, Jesus was the Lord.
Okay. Well, I mean, but it says brother of the Lord. Mm-hmm. When in Paul's theology, when does Jesus become Lord? Was he always Lord?
So that's a good question. Paul had what could be described as a high Christology, believing that Jesus was deity in some sense. It's a debated question in what exact sense he meant, whether Paul thought he was pre-existent or not. But in any case, he thought that Jesus was in some sense divine. But I don't think that necessarily means that Jesus was in some spiritual realm anywhere in antiquity. Divine beings existed on earth all the time. There were people who became divine. It was a common motif in antiquity. So for Paul is referring to the figure of Jesus. And if you don't accept mythicism, then that person would have been a Jewish rabbi in the first century.
Well, yeah, but my point is that you don't become the Lord Jesus rather didn't become the Lord until after his resurrection. Because, before that point, he would have just been some, Jewish guy walking around, right?
I think it's fair to say that nobody would have, I don't want to necessarily say nobody, but not many people would have called him Lord prior to his alleged resurrection, sure. And Paul was certainly after that. Paul didn't come to the Christian scene until after all of that was already done. Now, whether or not Paul thought Jesus was in some sense divine prior to that point, I think is debatable. But certainly after resurrection, for Paul, Jesus is Lord.
Right. So why is it? Do you think that it's ridiculous to interpret it as a fictive kinship title, or do you?
I don't think it's ridiculous. I think, it's for sure that Paul uses fictive kinship all over the place, right? So him using fictive kinship here wouldn't be absurd. It's just that it's not the most straightforward reading of the passage. It doesn't fit with James being an apostle. It's a language he doesn't use anywhere else. So he calls people brother all the time, but not in this way. He only uses this language 2 times in a very specific sense, and only in a way that it seems to me would make more sense if he was talking about an actual brother, like a physical blood brother, as opposed to fictive kinship.
Well, okay, so here's why I don't believe that, and I'm not convinced by it. Considering that Paul separates himself from any historical sourcing whatsoever, and he says that he only gets his information from a celestial Jesus, and the fact that the Lord is a title for the celestial version of Jesus, it seems like he's talking about another Christian. Also, are you telling me that you reject the notion that this James is the same James as Galatians 2?
No, I think Galatians 2, well, there's some debate, but I believe the weight of scholarship is that the Galatians 2 James, the pillar, is the same James in Galatians 1. They'd be the same person. But I think what you said there about it being a celestial Jesus and whatnot, I think that's kind of begging the question. If you assume that Jesus is in fact only a celestial being, then certainly it has to be just some run-of-the-mill Christian, right? Because a celestial being can't have a physical brother. But if you don't accept that, then it could be that there's no reason, if under the hypothetical that Jesus did exist, then there's no reason to suppose that this physical person who was in some sense divine and ascended to heaven or whatever had a brother. There's nothing stopping a physical Jesus from having a brother, is what I mean. I don't see why Paul would have a problem with that.
Well, but you see, I'm not presuming anything. I feel like you're strawmanning me in that particular rendition of what I just literally said, because what I said was that Paul considered Jesus at this point to be celestial. He's
Okay.
a celestial being at this point. When he refers to the Lord, he's referring to the celestial version of Jesus. And regardless of how he perceived him beforehand, saying that James is the brother of the Lord says that he is the brother of this celestial being, the Lord, which, by the way, is right in line with Paul's theology on the family of God, being that once you are a baptized Christian, you're baptized into the family of God. And Jesus being the firstborn of many brethren, it kind of seems like that. How could that not mean? Maybe you can explain this to me. How could that not mean that all Christians are brothers and sisters of the Lord?
So I think for Paul, all Christians were, in some sense, brothers and sisters in the Lord. I mean, he uses that fictive kinship all the time. But let's not assume one way or the other. Let me try to repeat what I said in a way that accurately reflects your position. I didn't intend to strawman you if I did. My apologies. So you say that Jesus at this point is divine, and so this divine person at this point, the point when Paul's.
Well, to Paul, just to be clear, I don't think Jesus is divine.
Of course, we're both atheists. Neither of us thinks that he's divine. So at this point, at the point he's writing, Paul thinks that Jesus has ascended to heaven. Whether he was earthly at some point or not, he's definitely in heaven now, right? By the time he's writing. And so what you said, if I heard you correctly, that would mean that this now divine being, whether he was divine before or not, can't have a brother because he's divine, and that brother wouldn't be here. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I'm saying that it. Technically, my position is that this is a vague this is a vague verse that doesn't give us a clear indication either way. But the explanation of it's a bunch of compounding facts. The fact that Paul considers everybody to be a brother and sister of the Lord, being part of the Lord's family, and then calling somebody brother of the Lord, with Lord being a celestial title, kind of seems to imply some kind of fictive kinship here, regardless of whether or not Jesus was a literal person on earth.
Okay, so I think if Jesus had existed on earth, then even if Paul believed that we were all in some sense, or we being the Christian church at that time, they all were in some sense brothers and sisters in the Lord. If Jesus did exist and the Jesus on earth had brothers, then I think it makes sense that, and if Paul wanted to refer to one of them, then it makes sense that he would call him a brother, and he would mean it in a different sense than he meant it for the Christians. I mean, Christians do this now, right? Christians all the time call themselves brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so, my brother and sister in Christ. But that doesn't stop them from calling people brother and meaning their physical brother, right? It's still a thing that they believe. And I think most Christians, it's fair to say, while they call themselves brothers, they have this fictive kinship, they don't mean it in precisely the same sense as a person who came out of the same womb you did, right?
Sorry, say that again?
So Christians today, just like Christians in antiquity, have this idea of fictive kinship. Paul certainly had this idea. But I don't think that means that necessarily a blood brother of Jesus is exactly the same thing as a fictive kinship brother. Like, I think if in the hypothetical where Jesus existed, then it's not impossible to think that Paul would have referenced this guy, the brother of the Lord, like the Lord's brother.
Well,
Right.
don't you think that if that's what Paul was doing, which I really hate building all of this off of a hypothetical, but in any case, uh, if that's what Paul was doing, don't you think that it makes more sense to say the brother of Jesus rather than brother of the Lord, which is a celestial like title for a celestial being?
No, because for Paul, Jesus is Lord, and so they are the same being. So for Paul, it's not that you have Jesus, this person, right, and then Jesus, the celestial being, and like there's some bifurcation there. For Paul, Jesus is a Lord. They are the same thing, and that's his Christology, and
Okay.
so
Now
uh,
I'm fine with that, but the fact that he only ever knows a celestial Jesus, to me, that makes this like very unclear as to what he's talking about here.
Well, Paul, it doesn't seem at least, ever met Jesus. So in terms of like knowing, the only Jesus he encountered himself was in some kind of visionary experience of some sort, right?
Mhm.
So that's the Jesus Paul knows personally, and Paul goes to some length to say that that's where he got his gospel from. That's where he got all his information from. But surely he didn't get all his information from there, right? Because he was persecuting Christians before that, and he had to have known something about them. I mean, surely he didn't just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to go persecute these people. He had to know enough about their religion at least to decide that it was heretical enough to be worthy of persecution. And so he obviously didn't get all his information from whatever vision he got, right? So even according to Paul's own story, it can't be that he got all his information about Christians from his vision, right?
Well, I mean, I think that the only way that Paul could relay information was if he got it directly from Jesus himself, the celestial version of Jesus. So I don't think that it matters necessarily what he got from like Christians on earth. The fact is that he says that he didn't like he didn't get this information that he has had confirmed by Jesus directly from any person. Like there was to emphasize the fact that he got it directly from Jesus himself as a celestial figure. So I don't think that it matters whether or not he knew one thing or another, but also you can't say exactly what he got from people. Like you can't know what information he would have obtained from a historical source because he doesn't cite anything.
I wouldn't say I know for sure what he got. I mean, it's something more than zero. It would have to be necessarily because he's persecuting them. So, like, I don't know how we would get to the persecution part without knowing anything about them. But regardless, whether he believes he got his information from a vision or not, I don't see that that really has much bearing on whether or not this person is the Lord's brother, or because, again, for Paul, Jesus is the Lord. That they're the same thing. And so whether Paul only encountered this being in a vision or not, I don't see why that bears any weight on whether or not that person physically existed in the past.
Well, you see that's just it. I don't. I mean, I feel like you're making my argument for me here because I'm saying that this right here has no effect on whether or not like Jesus existed in the past, like entirely. Like
Okay.
I don't think that it had like I think it has equal weight for both arguments, but the mythicist explanation for the phrase "brother of the Lord" makes more sense when you consider the complete context of Paul's theology surrounding it.
So if Paul is talking about a James who was a physical brother of Jesus, if that is the person he's talking about, then mythicism is false. Just full stop. That you can't have a physical blood brother if you don't exist, right? So it's certainly relevant whether this person existed, because if James existed and James is the brother of Jesus in the blood relation sense, then Jesus existed.
Well, I mean, I mean, honestly, for this passage, I think that all that would indicate would be that Paul thought that he was the brother of Jesus.
Okay.
Not that it's not like we have an account from James himself or anything like that. Now, I'm willing to grant you that if this is referring to a literal blood relative to Jesus, and that's what Paul is saying, that definitely gives historicity a little bit more credence. But I think that you would need to be able to prove that it was more than just Paul's belief about it, and we just simply don't have that anywhere in evidence.
So that would require that Paul met this person. This person was a leader in the church. He was well known. He had people following him in Antioch. It says in Galatians 2, he was a pillar, right? So clearly he's an important person.
Oh, no. Hold on. So sorry. This James is not the pillar. This James is a completely different James.
I don't think that's established certainly not in the scholarship.
It's definitely established in the scholarship. Yes, it is.
Okay, not according to, hold on. I've got a meta-analysis, which might be relevant. So if I can find it in my pile of things. It was written by a gentleman who works out of the University of Helsinki. James the Just in History and Tradition, Matti Milkoski, I think is how you say that. And this was written in 2007, and it's basically a survey of scholarship for the past century on James, including whether or not he was the pillar. I think
until when?
Well, it was written in 2007, so it was written.
Oh, okay. So it's not the most recent scholarship then. Okay.
No, it is not the most recent thing ever published. No.
Okay,
but
so it doesn't include any scholarship after 2007. It only includes scholarship that ranges between 1907 and 2007.
Well, it certainly can't include something after it was written. No.
Okay.
But the point is that this is a debated thing in the scholarship. I don't think it's established for sure whether he is the pillar, something that scholars debate. But in either case, this is if James, you have to believe that Paul met this person, that Paul is mistaken about this person being a brother. And then you would also simultaneously have to believe that Josephus is also not referring to this person, and Josephus is also mistaken. You'd have to hold all of those beliefs at the same time, right? And so
I don't think Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus.
In that case, you are in stark disagreement with virtually every Josephus scholar, which is fine.
I really don't give a fuck about that. I really don't care if I am or not.
So we're skeptics, right? And neither of us, to the best of my knowledge, are experts in any of this. I certainly am not. And so I try to get my history from historians and my physics from physicists and my biology from biologists, because nobody can be an expert in everything. And so if, as a heuristic, if I find myself in disagreement with the vast and overwhelming majority of people who are well-educated and informed on a topic, then what is more likely? That all of these people who've dedicated their entire lives to this topic are wrong and I have somehow stumbled on the truth, or that they know more than I do, they know something I don't, and I'm mistaken? I think the second one is probably more likely, right? Because we're laymen.
I mean, you're totally misrepresenting the situation here, because it's not like I'm a random ass fuck from the internet that thinks that all the experts are wrong. I mean, you present yourself as basing your opinions off of scholarship, which I commend you for. But at the same time, you have to recognize that I base my positions off of the scholarship as well.
Well, okay, so let me ask.
I have scholars, you have scholars. We could sling shit all day if you wanted to, throwing scholars around everywhere. But the fact is that the arguments against the James passage and the test in Josephus being a legitimate thing that was there seems far more convincing to me than the apologists that argue for the James being the brother of Christ or whatever in Josephus's writings.
So I think classifying Josephine scholars as apologists is misleading at best, because it's not a field that's dominated by apologists. Josephus is a figure of Jewish history, right? And so many of the scholars who study Josephus are Jewish. If you look at a companion to Josephus, which was published in 2015, or the latest edition was, the two editors, both of them are from secular universities. It cites about 20, I think I have the exact count written down. But the way that if you just look through all the scholars in this compendium of scholarship that's supposed to like give you a survey of the field of Josephine scholarship, about a third are Jewish. About a third come from universities like Stanford and Berkeley, and they're experts in Roman history and, the classics, etc. And then about a third are scholars of the New Testament. But even they are not necessarily apologists. Just being a Christian doesn't make you an apologist. You can be a good historian anyway, right?
But most New Testament scholars are definitely apologists. They've been trained in theology. They've been trained by predominantly Christian universities. They are most definitely apologists, just with degrees.
So I think that by basically throwing out an entire field, New Testament studies, and it sounded like you were lumping in Josephine scholarship as well. Correct me if I'm misinterpreting there, but it sounded like you were. I think that's doing a disservice to the scholars that work in that field. I would agree with you that there are scholars, particularly in New Testament studies, who work for places that require them to sign statements of faith and those sorts of things. And I can understand why you'd want to throw those scholars out. But that certainly is not all scholarship. There are many good scholars who happen to be Christian, but they're still good scholars. I don't think that secular scholarship means secular scholars. Religious scholars can do good scholarship. Incidentally, that's in Richard Carrier makes that point himself in his opening on the historicity of Jesus. So, I mean, I don't think that's me being uncharitable. I think that
what does Carrier have in the beginning of his book?
He has the book right here on the historicity of Jesus. So if you look at
you've actually read it.
Oh, I've read it several times. That Proving History. Actually, when I was looking into the historical Jesus, this was the first book I read, incidentally. Yeah.
So what makes Carrier's position shit and the others' positions better?
Well, okay. So again, speaking from a heuristic point of view, leaving mythicism aside for a moment, you can find an expert, a bona fide, well-educated expert in a field, a particularly large field, that's going to occupy some kind of outlier position. You can find one that'll believe almost anything, right? And so just that, the simple fact that you have a single expert or a small number of experts, if they are in opposition to the rest of the field, then it could be that small number of experts is correct. That certainly happens. That's how change gets engendered, right? But if we as non-experts, and I know you're an engineer. I don't know what other education you may have attained. So maybe you are an expert. I know I'm not. So at least for me, I am particularly skeptical when I find an expert like Carrier, who I would be inclined to agree with, because it would be awesome if mythicism were true, right? That if to the extent I have a bias, it would be towards mythicism.
No, I mean, it doesn't really matter to me, like whether or not mythicism's true. Like, I know a lot of historicists out there like to paint mythicists as having some kind of dogmatic bias towards it, but it really doesn't have, it's no skin off my back if Jesus actually existed. I just have analyzed the evidence and I'm not convinced by the historicist argument. So just putting that out there.
To the extent that I have a bias, if I have one that exists on this topic, it would be towards Carrier's position.
Okay.
I'm not going to paint that again on anyone else, but Carrier is an outlier. So when I read Carrier, it sounded very compelling. I wasn't very educated in the field, so like his book is very erudite and well written. And so naturally, the next question I asked was, okay, well, how come no other, or virtually no other scholar in the field is convinced? And then I read those other scholars and found their arguments more convincing.
Hey, heathens. So I did want to just pop in real quick and point out how Carrier is not the only one that is making the case that this is an accidental interpolation. G.A. Wells concludes this, as well as Ken Olson. Carrier is using his own textual analysis along with these two scholars in order to form his opinion. As shown on the screen here, you can plainly see that Carrier is also using expert opinion in the field of textual analysis in order to identify this particular phrase, who would be called Christ, as an interpolation. And in fact, this particular phrase follows all of the criteria needed for identifying an interpolated phrase. And as you can tell, expert opinions do verify that accidental interpolations happen in sources like Josephus all the time. Carrier's actual position here is that the phrase, who was called Christ, was accidentally interpolated, and what was originally there would have required Josephus to be specific about what Jesus he was talking about later. I personally find this explanation to be far more parsimonious than the counter arguments against it. I do want you to listen to Jordan's explanation and make up your own mind for yourself, because I feel like most people can plainly read the evidence. Y'all can understand both sides of the arguments, and you can come to your own conclusion. But let me know which side you find more convincing.
So I don't disagree that Carrier could be right. He very well could be. But I think that as skeptics, we should be very hesitant to accept a fringe position that against the well-informed bulk of scholarship. I think that's something we should be very, very hesitant to do because we're likely to be wrong.
Well, so let me get this straight. Your entire point for rejecting Carrier and not just Carrier, but like rejecting a bunch of the whole textual critics and everything like that have studied like interpolations and everything like that. You're saying that it's only because the majority of people that are arguing or are looking at this particular verse, just because the majority of them disagree with Carrier, that's literally the only evidence that you have against Carrier?
No, I mean, I think we've had a discussion just now on some of the reasons why I think he's wrong on this particular topic. We can talk more about Josephus and the reasons I think he's incorrect.
I was specifically talking about Josephus. Like, it seems to me like you're rejecting Carrier primarily because more people don't agree with him.
No,
on Josephus.
What I'm saying is that before, like, kind of a priori, to use the language of Bayes' theorem, if we're just kind of looking at a question in scholarship as skeptics, and we see that there's one person, or we'll say 5 people, there's probably not even, I don't know the full number of mythicist scholars, but there's not many. So if there's a few mythicist scholars, and then you've got hundreds of other scholars who disagree, I would think that the more likely thing is that the hundreds are correct. They are not necessarily correct, but I think it's more likely that they are. Then we can look into it and see if their arguments are persuasive and all those things. But we should, as skeptics, be hesitant to reject the consensus of scholars without a very good reason to do so. That's the point I'm making.
Oh, okay. And you think that Carrier's argument is not good enough reason?
Yeah, I think that Carrier's argument hasn't convinced Josephine scholars, certainly. And
no, that's. I mean, I don't. Like I said, these quote unquote Josephine scholars, I don't think that just because they agree about something that means that they are correct. What I do, and maybe I'm just fucked up in how I do this. You know, maybe you can elucidate how wrong-headed my thinking is. But here's my thinking. I am intelligent enough, regardless of my training, I'm intelligent enough to be able to read 2 positions who lay out all the evidence for both of their sides. And I'm intelligent enough to figure out which one makes more sense. So I don't have to be like, oh, this side over here has 343 scholars, while this side over here has 2. Because it's not just Carrier. There's plenty of others that are also on Carrier's side about this. But I mean, that just It's got the less amount of scholars over here. Like
So
I really don't think that judging the truth about something based on numbers, like in this particular situation, is the best way to come to a conclusion.
I feel like you're mischaracterizing what I said a little bit, because I'm
Okay.
not saying that's the only way that we should assess it at all. That we should see a majority, we should stop thinking immediately and walk away. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, but to your point, I'm sure you're an extremely intelligent guy. You seem intelligent. I have no reason to doubt your capabilities. Um, but we're not experts, and so experts have at their disposal better background knowledge. They have a deeper understanding of the topic. Just necessarily, we can't be experts in everything. I know I'm not. Like I think you're a software engineer. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I am a nuclear engineer by training. I've done some software engineering work, just kind of my weird journey. But I am certain that you know more about software engineering than I do, because it's your specialty. And so, if I thought A about software engineering and virtually every software engineer alive thought B, I should think that I'm probably wrong. Now, maybe I'm not, but wouldn't you agree that all else being equal, a large number of experts in a field are more likely to be right than a person who has no expertise in their field? Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I agree that if you're not an expert in the field, like you yourself making the determination that their arguments aren't sufficient enough, I don't think that's warranted. But again, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not doing that.
So I say all that just to say that I have to file that as like part of the background that when I'm approaching this. If I'm approaching this and knowing that position A is the consensus of scholars, by consensus I mean the overwhelming consensus, and position B is held by a very few scholars, then I go into this knowing that the people who have more understanding than I do, that have the deeper knowledge, that have the background, that have the context, they have all been, or mostly all been, persuaded of a certain thing. That doesn't necessarily persuade me in and of itself, but it is evidence towards that position. It's something I should take into account. When it comes to Josephus on James, while the Testimonium Flavianum is highly contentious, uh, most scholars think that there was some kind of thing there, but how much or what is hotly debated. But when it comes to James, the James passage in 20, it's not debated that much. There's a few scholars that, I mean, you're going to find scholars that publish on it, a couple, but there's not many. It's just that's the position since about the turn of the century. That's been the consensus of Josephine scholars. And again, these are not apologists; these are experts in Jewish history. These are
Well,
Roman
no, but I
classicists.
mean, you say that you're not making the argument that you should just see where the consensus lies and then determine that that's the truth. But then you turn around and you say exactly that. You
So
you
we
say
can.
that hold on. You say that you should look at it, and if you've got this fringe element that disagrees with the consensus, you should always go with the consensus. That's what I'm getting from you, at least.
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm not saying that the fringe element cannot be right. They can be right. Let me say this as emphatically as I can. Just because the majority of scholars say something does not make it true. It is not necessarily true. That said, the consensus of scholars is evidence towards the position of consensus. It is a piece of evidence that we should take into account. I think it's a reasonably strong piece of evidence for a layman, for someone who themselves doesn't have any expertise. Now, if you want, and I'd love to, we can get into the evidence that personally persuades me that the consensus is in fact correct on James, the brother of Jesus, and Josephus. Because it's not that I saw that there was a consensus and stopped reading. I read the consensus opinion, uh, and I'd love to talk about it. I'm just saying that the consensus is a valuable piece of information.
Okay. But you at least agree that the consensus can be wrong.
Sure, definitely.
then what benefit is the consensus? Shouldn't it be, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe I'm wrong about the fact that the evidence should prove their position, and the counters to it should not be strong enough to overcome their position. Is that not a good way? Like, because I feel like somebody that's not like heavily interested in this topic, I get going with the consensus. I'm perfectly fine with that, but that's not like we're not two people that haven't read into the scholarship on this. We're two people that are invested in it at least somewhat, and we have read the scholarship. We're both intelligent people. Why is it that we can't look at the consensus's evidence and then look at the opposition's evidence and then weigh those those pieces of evidence against each other to see which one's more convincing?
So I agree that ultimately it's the evidence that decides the discussion. What I am skeptical of my own capabilities as a non-expert to accurately assess that evidence. I take on this my intellectual humility and understanding my own limitations, and this comes from my own past. I used to be a young Earth creationist, so I know just how wrong I can be. I can be very, very wrong, in fact, and I did that in flew in the face of every scientist on the planet, right? And so I know from my own personal experience how wrong my, I thought, well-researched opinion can be. And so I think it behooves us to at least take some intellectual humility and understand that, because of our own limitations as people and our expertise, it is possible that we may not be assessing the evidence accurately.
Is it not incumbent upon the scholars that write the journal articles or the monographs or the books, is it not incumbent upon them to be able to lay out the evidence in a way that people can understand and make a decision for themselves? Is that not incumbent upon the scholar? Does in order to have a position, or in order not to have a position, but in order to weigh the evidence of either side, do you have to be an expert in whatever thing that you're trying to decide upon?
So it would be great if every scholar could write every paper such that someone who has no experience in the field or limited experience or whatever for any, any experience level, to be able to understand it, pick it up and read
Well,
it.
no,
Right?
so specifically, I'm talking about our experience
Okay.
level. Like,
Uh,
I'm not. I don't know if that changes it or anything like
Okay.
that, but I feel like we're both kind of experienced in this particular, at least at researching it.
So, for example, reading Trudinger and Howard's conversation back and forth, because that's something we're both familiar with. They're talking about the exact verb tenses of Greek. I have no way of assessing who's right. I can listen to their arguments, but if Howard is saying something that's incorrect, it's unlikely that I'm going to know of myself that that's the case because I don't have any kind of grounding in ancient Greek. I'm only going to know that if some other scholar comes along and points it out. And so those are the kind of things that I, as a layman, am likely to miss just because I don't have that deep education, if that makes sense. And so,
Okay.
and so I'm always kind of understanding that in the background, there is that failure state. There is that case where the scholar that I'm reading is incorrect or has interpreted something wrong or whatever. His argument isn't good enough. I don't know. And I won't know. I don't have the tools to know. That's the failure state that I'm concerned about when I take into account the consensus.
Okay. But in the case of like Carrier, who has a peer-reviewed journal article on the James passage being interpolated, I mean, I don't really see him going into that fine tuned of like an argument against it. He appeals to textual analysis. He appeals to basic logic of the flow of that particular paragraph. He appeals to internal inconsistencies within the paragraph. He appeals to a lot of things that aren't, Greek verb tenses, that I don't think that the historicist side can really overcome. So maybe this is a good segue into you presenting like the reasons why you're convinced by the consensus about the James passage in Josephus.
Sure. So I'm sure all your listeners are well aware of Josephus. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, and he's talking, this is particularly in Antiquities 20, when he is talking about the procession of a high priest and the conditions under which Jesus, son of Damnius, ascended to the high priesthood. And so the way it's written in the extant manuscripts is, so he assembled a Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And then it goes on. That's the part. Now, Carrier's position is that this is a Christian interpolation. If, as I understand it, Carrier believes that a scribe wrote a note basically to himself that this Jesus was the Christ, right? And that later, and through successive copying, that note got incorporated into the text as the actual text, right? So there's a few reasons why I don't think that this works, and I'm getting this from the scholars, again, who know way more than I do. But these are the arguments that that persuade me. First of all, it isn't as simple as the fact that there was like a Jesus who's the brother of James, and then some scholar pointed to it and said that's the Christ. There would have been an appellation there, Jesus. If this had happened, as Carrier said, there would have been Jesus, son of Damnius, and the scholar basically would have had to say, no, it wasn't the son of Damnius, it was this other guy. But what Carrier says is that the scholar may have thought that the later Jesus, son of Damnius, he basically copied it twice, basically, right? But that requires that Josephus wrote the appellation twice. That requires that it was Jesus, son of Damnius up here, and then a couple lines later, Jesus, son of Damnius down here. That's how the scholar would have written it twice, right? If he saw it and he was copying it. That would be out of character for the way that Josephus uses appellations. So throughout the Antiquities and his other writings, Josephus uses an appellation when he establishes who the person is and then doesn't use it again in subsequent references unless there's an intervening person with the same name. So for an example of that, you can see Antiquities 19, chapter 6. He's referencing Jonathan, son of Ananus, and then a few sentences later, he just calls him Jonathan. You can see it again in Antiquities 20, just a couple lines before the thing we were just talking about. He's talking about Joseph, who was called Cabby, the son of Simon, and then a line later, he calls him Joseph. This is how Josephus uses appellations. And so if this area was written the way that Josephus tends to write, what it would have been is Jesus, son of Damnius, whose brother was James, and then later just Jesus, and the scholar not only replaced the first son of Damnius with who was called Christ, but then also put that other son of Damnius down at the bottom, if that makes sense. So that's what would have happened there. I can keep going, but I want to give you a chance to cut in if you want.
Well, I just while it may be while Josephus may have done that in some places, I don't think that it's necessarily out of the realm of plausibility or or possibility that he referenced Jesus, son of Damnius, twice. But also, I think that the reference to that was taken out of there could have been any number of things that that could have been there, and that would have warranted Josephus to write, son of Damnius later. So I mean, I think that you presuming these hardline sort of possibilities here as explanations is a little too like black and white or dichotomous. I think that there's plenty of explanations that perfectly fit that allow Josephus to reference son of Damnius later in the passage.
So certainly Josephus could have been referencing some completely other Jesus. Jesus was a very common name, as I'm sure you know. And so Jesus, son of Joe, whose brother was James. And then later he's talking about Jesus, ben Damnius. And so the scribe replaced this other random Jesus with the Jesus of Nazareth that we know of, the Jesus who was called Christ. That is certainly possible. I think at that point it's kind of ad hoc. You're just saying, well, maybe it was this other person. Certainly it could be, but that seems like an ad hoc assertion. I don't know that there's any evidence that it wasn't the thing we have. But there's other things. I think there's other things.
I don't think it's ad hoc.
Okay, so can you point me to the evidence that Josephus was referencing not a Jesus who wasn't the son of Damius, some other Jesus? Can you point me to the manuscript evidence for that? Or
wait, did not pointing to a Jesus son of Damius?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, what you said was you've got two references to a Jesus. The bottom one is definitely son of Damius. Right. So in the top one, if I heard you correctly, you said he could have been talking about some other Jesus.
No.
And then, okay, so I guess I didn't hear you correctly. What I heard was...
Maybe I mispronounced or said something that was a little vague or confusing. I meant that the Jesus that is later identified as Jesus, son of Damius, he could have been referenced in various ways right there that would still require Josephus to indicate Jesus, son of Damius later. So, I mean, there's plenty of ways that Josephus could have referenced that Jesus up above that would later require specifying son of Damius.
So if I'm hearing this right, you're saying he could have referenced him as something other than son of Damius, requiring that he called him son of Damius later?
I'm saying that he could have referred to him in some other way that is not that would require that. Yeah.
So why wouldn't he why refer to him again as son of Damius if he already referred to him as a way that would define it for the reader? Like, that's the whole point of an appellation. So if he said Jesus, whatever appellation he used, which to Josephus was sufficient to tell the people who this was, why an appellation later? That would be out of character for Josephus the way he writes. So why would...
I'm not sure that that's true, but I'll have to look into that.
Sure, totally fair. So in addition to the taking out, there's a couple other things that don't make a lot of sense to me. If you've got Jesus, son of Damius, whose brother was James is the son of Damius too. It seems like a little clunky way to get to it. I don't know if that's out of character for Josephus. I don't know the Greek, so it's possible that's just the way Greek works. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I'm not able to read the original there. Another thing that I hear Carrie and others have said is that if Josephus were to have said that this was Jesus who was called Christ, the so-called Christ, that would have necessarily required that Josephus tell his audience who this Christ was, because they wouldn't necessarily know. And it is true that in most places of Josephus, when he uses a title, he usually gives some kind of brief explanation as to what the title was, but not always. If you look at Antiquities 14, chapter 13, he says, but Pacorus left with Herod 200 horsemen and 10 men who were called the freemen and conducted others on the journey. And he never says why they're the freemen. What does that mean? That they're the freemen. And he just leaves it there. Antiquities 20, chapter 8, the Joseph who is called Cabby. Why is he Cabby? He doesn't say. He just is.
So wouldn't Josephus need to explain to the audience that he's writing to what a Christ was in connection with the Jews? Because, I mean, wasn't he writing to a Gentile audience?
So what I meant to say just now is that while that is certainly a thing that Josephus could have done, and maybe even probably would have done, it's not necessary. We have other examples in Josephus himself in the very same chapter that this is happening, where he calls somebody by an appellation and doesn't explain what that appellation is. An appellation that wouldn't necessarily be clear, like the freeman, for example. That doesn't have any intrinsic meaning. It's just the title, but he doesn't say what it means.
Is there some kind of reference somewhere that would indicate that his audience would know what freemen are or what a cabbie was?
I don't know. It could be that was a common term at the time, and I'm just not aware of it. I didn't see that said anywhere in the scholarship that I read in that book that I mentioned, the compendium or any of the other papers I read. But if it was, if it was the case that cabbie and freeman were things that any Gentile likely to pick up his book would know, then I guess that would make sense. I'm
Well,
skeptical that that's the case, but
well, I mean, I that's why I'm asking the question. Like, I don't know. What I
yeah, I
what
don't
I
know either.
do know is that when Josephus references like I believe it's the Pharisees, he explains who they are.
Hmm.
And so it seems like when it's a group that would be outside of the general knowledge base for his Gentile audience, it seems like he would need to explain that. So
So
if so saying he who was called Christ, I mean, his audience would be like, who in the heck is Christ? Like, what is a Christ? What does a Christ mean to these people? And I mean, considering the testimonium probably wasn't even there, it's kind of weird that. But even if it was there, it's weird that there's no callback to it. It's weird that there's no explanation for what a Christ is. There's just a lot of weird things surrounding this reference to Christ.
So I think you brought up a good point there with the testimonium. This particular objection that he would have had to have explained what a Christ is contingent upon believing that the testimonium Flavianum is a complete interpolation with no historical core, which is a position that some of the Josephine scholars hold. I don't know what the percentage is. It's certainly a hotly debated question. I think most scholars, if there is, to the extent that there is a majority, believe that there's some kind of core, but what that core was is a completely open question. So I don't think it's unreasonable at all to think that the Testimonium Flavianum was an interpolation. But if you're going to hold that objection for the Antiquities 20 passage, it's also contingent on the probability that you're right about the Testimonium as well. Because if there was a previous reference to Christ in some sense, then it's plausible that he'd already explained it. Basically, he would already have told them who this
Well,
person was.
I don't, but I see. I don't think it's as contingent as you think, because regardless of whether or not the Testimonium Flavianum was there, uh, it would be it would behoove Josephus to refer to it as an explanation, like he does for other Jewish groups. So it kind of seems to me like, saying that my argument is contingent upon the testimonium not being there is a bit of a misleading statement.
Well, can you agree that if the testimonium were there, in some sense, and he had, in some sense, explicated who this Jesus Christ was, then it would be less weird for him to reference Jesus Christ in Antiquities 20 without going into a thing about it. Can you agree with that?
I don't. Yeah. So I think it would be less weird for him to not go into a thing about it, but I think that he would definitely need to reference it in some way, similar to how he does other Jewish groups.
So, if I'm hearing you right, it would be, you think it would still be improbable that he wouldn't reference it, but it would be less improbable than if the testimonium didn't exist at all. Is that a fair summary?
It wouldn't be less.
Sorry, I probably didn't say that well. Uh, if the testimonium didn't exist at all, he would more probably have explained who the Christ was.
Yes.
If the testimonium existed in some sense, then it's more probable than it would have been otherwise that he wouldn't have explained who the Christ was. So maybe the probability goes up a bit, but maybe not to 100% or whatever, because he still didn't call back to the testimonium if it had existed. And so maybe that's a little weird. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I mean, I think that no reference at all is kind of what my argument is like the fact that there's no reference at all is what is weird to me. So I don't know how to judge like how more historical it would be if there's just a simple reference back to the testimonium. But I think that if the who was called Christ was there, then that would indicate a need to either explain what a Christ was or refer back to the testimonium if it were there. So if it wasn't there, then we would need a full explanation. If the testimonium wasn't there, was there, then we would expect a callback to it.
It certainly would be great if he'd given a callback. I think that, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things I'd love to have that we sadly don't. I'd love to have I'd love to have Josephus writings before Eusebius touched them, for example. But Such as it is. Anyways, I think that the combination of the fact that he doesn't always explicate these appellations, combined with the fact that he may at least have reference to Christ before, and the fact that who this Christ was isn't super important for the story. The whole reason of mentioning Jesus there at all is just to say who this James was, and that's the only reason this character comes up. It doesn't to me make it strong enough to throw it away. Now, I could be wrong. I freely admit that I could be wrong. Again, I'm not an expert. To the extent that anyone cares about what the experts say, the experts think that the passage is authentic. And again, these are not all apologists.
So I've got a notepad thing open. I mean, can you cite? Do you have like a list of citations for some of these people who are not apologists?
Sure. Let me find where I put that in my massive document here. So here are some examples from the book. The book is a companion to Josephus by Honora Howell Chapman. That's the biggest book I bought to read on this topic. But some of the scholars for Josephus would be Chapman herself. She has a classics from Stanford, currently at Fresno State. Zuleika Rogers is a professor of Jewish studies, did her dissertation on Josephus, Trinity College of Dublin, but that Trinity College is not an apologetic university that has a statement of faith or anything like that. Alice Wheely, I'm sorry. I did check if that's what you're asking.
Well, Trinity College sounds a lot like a religious university.
Yeah,
so
which is fair, which is why I went and checked. When I saw Trinity College, I went and looked, and they're not like Biola or something like that. Alice Wheely has her PhD from UC Berkeley. She specializes in Josephus. Louis Feldman, who died in 2017, was one of the most preeminent scholars of the late 20th century on Josephus. He was a Jewish gentleman, or at least he came from a Jewish family. I don't know if he was practicing or not. That's just a sampling. I did go through just to kind of get a feel for what the field was like. I went through that companion that I mentioned, and like I said, from that list, which I can't tell you how representative that list of is to the field, but from that list at least, about 2/3 of them were not in any way connected to Christian apologetics. Their degrees were not in New Testament anything, or they were Jews, and the other third were not from apologetics universities, but they were scholars of the Bible in like the traditional New Testament sense. And so I think at least that Josephan scholars are uniquely positioned to kind of test this idea that we should throw away New Testament scholarship because of the apologists that practice in it. And the reason I say that is because if the reason that the scholars in the field had come to the conclusions that are contrary to Carrier's, if the reason they did that was because of their bias, because they're either because they're Christian or they were taught by Christians in the case of Ehrman and stuff like that, if that were the case, then I would think we would expect to see stark differences at the peripheries where they butt up against other fields of scholarship that don't have that kind of problem, like Josephus. But that's not what we see. Like, there's nothing in Josephan studies that requires them to think that this is an authentic reference to James. It wouldn't, like, what does that matter to a Josephan scholar? Either it is or it isn't, but Josephus was still Josephus, right? So I wouldn't think, at least, that there'd be the same pressure, to the extent that there is pressure in the New Testament studies. I wouldn't think that same pressure would exist for Josephus. And yet they seem to come to the conclusions that correspond well with what the other scholars in question believe. And so that seems at least suggestive that perhaps the conclusions of New Testament scholarship isn't wholly due to bias or their religious persuasions.
Okay, but I mean, again, I'm not sure when all of this was written, like the stuff that you gave me, but I'm not sure if it actually references the most recent scholarship, like on Josephan stuff.
So the book that I referenced, I've got some other papers too, but the book that I've been talking about for the list of scholars, that was published in 2015, or at least the edition I have was published in 2015.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the book was, but the opinions of the scholars here, like, do they actually deal with? Do any of them actually deal with like Carrier's criticisms of the Josephus passage or of the James passage?
So in that book, no. So they don't talk about Carrier at all. His work doesn't come up, and they don't talk too much about James. It's referenced kind of. There's a lengthy section on the Testimonium. So I'm sorry, when I was talking about this book, I was talking about it to back up the assertion about the prevalence of Christianity in Josephus studies, if that makes sense. This companion to Josephus is kind of looking at all the problems in Josephus studies and like the active questions, and the James doesn't even merit a mention there. They mention it briefly and like this is pretty much agreed by everybody. I think Alice Wheely in her section on the Testimonium references the later reference to James, if that makes sense.
So this book doesn't critically handle any of the criticisms of the James passage, and they just blanketly state everybody agrees about this thing, and that's supposed to be convincing to me.
So no, I'm not. The other arguments I gave you is what should be convincing. I hope at least they're convincing to me.
They're not convincing to me, but I mean, I respect that they're convincing to you. I'm just still thoroughly not convinced.
Okay. So the point I was trying to make with this companion, at least, is that this is a collection of rigorous scholarship that's fairly recent. 2015 is not that long ago, and it's a compendium. I think it's updated regularly, and I think this shows the quality of scholars in the field and how they don't have religious bents. It would. If the topic of James's brother is not controversial in the field, then there's no reason for them to spend a whole chapter in this book talking about it, if that makes sense. So I'm not like super surprised they didn't, because it's just not something. If something is settled scholarship, it isn't published very often, right? Like, so this is something.
Do you agree that ancient works were prone to interpolation?
Certainly interpolation happened. Yeah. I mean, no matter what else the Testimonium Flavianum, whether it was partly original or not, it certainly isn't 100% original, because then Josephus would be a Christian, right? So clearly, Josephus, at least in some parts, is subject to some interpolation. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
That's why I don't think it's completely absurd to think that there was a Christian interpolation in Antiquities 20. I don't think the mythicist position itself is completely absurd, like you have taken leave of all your senses and you're insane if you believe it. I don't think that the weight of evidence is for it. I think that it requires a lot of ad hoc assumptions. I don't think that it's the best, simplest explanation.
Can you name one thing that was an ad hoc assumption of mine tonight?
Trying to recall everything. So the way I heard what you were saying about how okay, so Jesus, Ben Damnius, son of Damnius, being referred as an appellation in some other way, and then later referred to as Jesus Ben Damnius, would be out of character for Josephus, and so to pull that seems ad hoc, because I don't see it evidenced in any other way, which is at least how I think of when I say ad hoc. Maybe you have a different understanding.
Well, no. So the hypothesis is that there was an interpolated part of that where who was called Christ was inserted. What I was saying is that we don't know what was originally there, if that were the case. And if it is an interpolation, which the phrase "who was called Christ" matches other marginal notes that exists out there, and the phrase and the grammar of it and everything like that matches how Christian scholars were writing these marginal notes. If that was a marginal note that eventually got accidentally interpolated into it, we don't know what was originally there. But considering that he references Jesus Ben Damnius later, then it makes sense that if it was interpolated, then it was written in a way that that Josephus felt the need to reference Ben Damnius again. So I don't think that that's ad hoc necessarily, as much as it's just critically thinking out the hypothesis and saying that we don't know what was there, but it's obviously something that would have warranted Ben Damnius being mentioned later. Like I feel like that's just a well thought out hypothesis.
So I agree that it's impossible to know with certitude what was written there because we weren't there. We weren't there when Josephus wrote it. We didn't get to observe the whole manuscript thing the whole way, right? But you could say that about anything in Josephus. I mean, any of it could have been interpolated by a later scribe for whatever reason. We'd have no way of knowing necessarily.
No, I don't think so, because I mean there were very specific ways marginal notes were written, and we have like extant marginal notes that exist that are incredibly similar to the "who was called Christ" phrase, that shows that it was something that would have been written by a Christian. So I don't think that supposing that "who was called Christ" as a marginal note is ad hoc, considering we have extant evidence that those marginal notes existed.
But we also have instances of Josephus calling people things, right? And so I haven't done a thorough study. Maybe I should try to find. I wish I read Greek. I should learn one day. One day I'll learn ancient Greek, right? But anyways, if Josephus, which I believe I have read that he uses that kind of phrasing, "who was called," but I didn't write down the citation, so everyone should doubt me and check, because I can't cite a authority to back up my terrible memory. If that is true, then I think that would at least counterbalance that. I don't think it's that crazy to think that Josephus could come with the phrasing "who was called." It doesn't seem like it's imbued with a bunch of Christology, so it doesn't seem like something weird for Josephus to say. And so the thing that I think sounds ad hoc to me, at least, is you've got the hypothesis that he's referencing the same person. And the counter to that is, well, if he was referencing the same person, why did he use the appellation twice? That's out of character. And so the thing that is brought up to address that is, well, he might have referenced them in a different way. But there's no evidence that he did reference them in a different way. He could have. It is a thing that could have happened. That's the nature of an ad hoc assertion. Of course, it addresses the objection. That's the whole point. But if you don't have some other piece of evidence, which I understand you're saying that the fact that we have marginal notes from Christians is the piece of evidence, I don't think it's that strong. Because if Josephus makes the same note, I don't think the fact that it would be kind of like, it sounds like something that would be a common phrase of the time. So I don't think it doesn't seem like that weird a thing for Josephus to say, if that makes sense.
You think that "who was called Christ" was a common phrase of the first century?
Or the so-called, which is, from my understanding, and again, I don't speak Greek, so I'm getting it from wherever I read it, the so-called so-and-so. So Jesus is the so-called Christ. That doesn't mean that Josephus thinks he's the Christ. It just means people called him the Christ.
Well, I can't think of any like secular historian in the first or second century that references Jesus that way, or his Christhood that way.
I would agree that there definitely isn't a secular historian in the first century other than Josephus, because Jesus is mentioned by any other historian in the first century. I believe Josephus is the only first century source. You start getting
Right.
some other sources in the early second century, arguably Tacitus, for example. But yeah, we don't have a ton of secular references to Jesus because he wasn't that important to secular people at the time. He didn't make much of an impact in the 30s, which is why I think the idea that he was like parading around like dead saints everywhere through Jerusalem is ridiculous, because if he'd done that, somebody would have mentioned it. So
yeah, well, I mean, I still don't see how my position's ad hoc, just because I have literal like evidence to suggest why Carrier would suggest an interpolation there. And so, I mean, with all of that being found in evidence, I still don't understand how it's ad hoc. But I mean, I appreciate you coming on to talk to me about it. And I know that we kind of got off. What we started talking about, like the brother of Jesus in Galatians 1:19, and then we kind of got off on James and Josephus. Was there anything else that you were wanting to talk about tonight?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I personally think that James, being the brother of Jesus, is the single best argument for historicity. It's not the only one, but because I think that if James was in fact the physical brother of Jesus, then he existed. It seems like it's super important, because if it's a defeater in and of itself, then that makes it an extremely important part of the conversation.
Right. So do you think that Paul got historical information from the other apostles in Galatians 2?
I don't know. I don't know that we can know. I am personally skeptical of Paul claims to have gotten all of his teachings from his visions, right? That was Paul's perception that he gives us. But first of all, since I don't think the visions were authentic, I don't think that Jesus actually came and talked to him, right? And the fact that Paul had been exposed to Christian teachings prior to that, at least sufficient to know that they were heretical, it seems to me unlikely. I believe that Paul believed it because he said so, and okay, sure enough. But I don't believe that he, in fact, received all of his thinking about Christ straight from Christ. Yeah, I don't think there was a Christ up there to give it to him. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but couldn't it be hallucinations that gave it to him and his reading of the scriptures?
Sure. But I think he certainly had exposure to Christians prior to his hallucinations. Because Paul tells us he was persecuting Christians, which I've said I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to waste your time. So I think that exposure, whatever it is, combined with everything else, would be sufficient to explain without requiring that Jesus always have been celestial, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if Jesus had always been celestial, then at least Paul wasn't the first one to come up with that idea, because again, they were Christians, right? So somebody other than Paul came up with this idea.
Oh yeah, definitely. Philo of Alexandria came up with it. I mean, at least he's an example of independent creation of this Messiah figure they know as Jesus. At least that's how I feel about it. But Jordan, I really appreciate you coming on today and having this discussion with me. Sorry if I became an asshole for a minute or two, but I appreciate the good conversation. While I'm not convinced, I would like to know if anybody watching was convinced by either of our sides. By either of the arguments. And I definitely do respect people that want to take the consensus route and appeal to people that seem to be more learned on the topic. But I still feel like analyzing their evidence is better than just taking them at their word, in my opinion. I feel the same way about climate change. Analyze the evidence for climate change. If there should be ways for people to communicate the evidence for climate change in a way that people can understand, and I think if the evidence is there, then it should easily be explained, is my opinion on it. But Jordan, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you and everything like that?
Yeah, so you can find our channel on YouTube, Reason to Doubt, just how it sounds. We're also on wherever podcasts are sold, Apple, iTunes, etc. We also have a Twitter if you want to hear me rant about random stuff. Press X_to_doubt.
Awesome. He's got a nice Fallout salesman on his profile, so it's pretty cool. But anyways, yes, please go follow Jordan here on Reason to Doubt. And I guess that we will see all you heathens later. All right, heathens. Well, that was the discussion that I had with Jordan on this particular topic of James, the supposed brother of Jesus, or brother of the Lord, rather. I wanted to step in and kind of give some of my final thoughts as I went back through this discussion and I formulated what things I wanted to add to the discussion that I didn't add during the discussion with Jordan. Because in these types of discussions, like either live or recorded or anything like that, you're not going to be able to get everything out that you want to. There's going to be definitely some parts that you're either not going to mention that you wish you had later, or you're going to think of things that you should have said better later. And so I wasn't really trying to have the last word with Jordan or anything like that. I was just trying to provide a fuller context to the conversation that we're having so that you guys are not missing out on any of the information. But essentially what I got out of this conversation was that it was just a big, dressed up, thought-stopping discussion. I know that Jordan was vehemently against the idea that that is what he was trying to do, but when it comes down to it, that's what got communicated to me. Basically, if we're not experts in the field and we don't know all of the information that is in that field, then we should just defer to the most popular argument. The idea that how popular an idea is as a gauge to how good the arguments or the evidence is for that idea is just a totally foreign concept to me. If I don't feel like I understand the evidence that's been presented, then I remain agnostic on it. I don't just automatically defer to the consensus, assuming that they have the best evidence out there. And appealing to ignorance and deferring to the consensus is something that will never convince me. I've come away just feeling like that's what Jordan did. At several points, he seemed to claim that since we're not experts in the field of Josephus studies or Koine Greek or anything like that, then we should just automatically defer to the consensus arguments, as if we don't have the capacity to analyze the arguments for both sides and then come to some kind of conclusion, an informed and educated conclusion. But then he turns around and he uses his own non-expert capacity to determine that the most popular argument is probably the one that's correct, just because everybody says that it is. Popularity, I feel, is just the weakest argument that you could present for your side of the discussion. But that's just what I got out of it. Maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe you can convince me that that's not what he was trying to do, even though it seems like at every turn, whenever we're talking about analyzing the evidence, he keeps going back to the argument from ignorance. Just we're ignorant of all this stuff, so obviously the experts are correct. When there are suitable experts that say that the consensus is wrong. But let me know down below with what you guys thought about this particular discussion between Jordan. I'd really love to hear what you guys think. Do you think that I'm just totally out there and that's not what Jordan was doing? Or do you think that Jordan was doing that? Just essentially appealing to popularity? Let me know down below in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.